Hi, I'm Nate Laskiewicz. I'm the host and co-producer of Lakes Region Fishing TV show, which airs on Channel 5 WPTZ on Sunday mornings. And I also have Vermont Lakes Region Fishing Guide Service, which is a guide service that fishes all of New York and Vermont. And we target warm water species, bass, pike, and walleye. And I have some clients like to do perch fishing in the fall. So all species that are warm water species on the lakes. I started off fishing when I was 8 years old, and I used to sneak out of the house and go down the river. Where I grew up, there was 3 rivers, and I used to go down and fish, and it was in my nature. And I'd come home, my dad would paddle my butt, and I'd be off the next day fishing again, not worried about getting paddled, because that fishing was more important to me than getting my butt whacked. So, but then as I got older, we grew up on Seneca Lake out in western New York and fished year-round. The lake never froze over, and fishing's been in my system ever since. I have a 21-foot bass boat, and I take up to 3 clients, and I supply everything from the equipment to the bait to the water we're going to go to. The only thing a client needs to bring is their fishing license and their lunch. And I target the lakes on basically on what they want to fish for or where they want to fish. If they don't know what they want to go for, then I'll select a lake that's producing. If they have a species they want to target, I'll try to pick a lake that's hot at that time. Or if they have a lake that they want to learn to fish, I'll take them to their lake and we'll figure it out. And I also do instructional fishing. I get a lot of clients that want to learn how to use bait casting reels and want to learn how to find fish. So it's a very important side and a large side of my business is the instructional fishing side. The easiest way is to go to the website, and it's fishinvermont.com. That's my website for my guiding service. And if you're interested in the TV show, it's lakesregionfishing.com. So what I talk about is finding fish in the Lakes Region area. Because one of the key things for anybody to go out fishing is you need to find the fish. And I have 3 key elements that I focus on when I first go out looking for fish. Structure, shade, and a food source. Because all fish, whether bass, pike, trout, they usually relate to structure to the point they want to be in an ambush situation where if bait fish comes by or crayfish, they want to be able to go out and grab that bait when it comes by. Shade. Fish have a tendency to be light sensitive, so I'm always looking for shade or low light intensity. And then food source. Whenever there's a food source, you're going to find some fish. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Other key elements when you're out fishing outside of my 3 main are water temperature, and that really plays a more important role for me in the spring and fall. I don't worry about water temperature in the early to late summer. Weather conditions, they're extremely important, whether it's rain, cloud, wind, which we'll talk about in a second. Water clarity. The thing with water clarity that's amazing is that a lot of people shy away from water clarity. Up here in the north, we have a lot of clear water. As soon as you get into some murky or stained water, fishermen seem to shut down and don't have the confidence that they should have in fishing stained water. And to me, water clarity is a big factor. If I'm fishing dingy or stained water, I'll change my tactics. I'll go with a wider crankbait that throws more water. It pushes the water out, and the fish have a tendency to pick that up through the lateral line. It's as good as noise, like rattles in crankbaits, vibration like chatterbaits or spinnerbaits with a Colorado blade that pushes water, causes a vibration. That'll be picked up. So those are the keys that I use when I'm fishing stained water. Clear water, it's more sight oriented, less sound and vibration. Wind, to me, wind is a big factor. I love fishing in the wind. Sometimes it can be an inconvenience fishing in the wind because you're fighting the wind as well as trying to concentrate on fishing. But when there's wind, I'll go to the windy side of a point or the windy side of a shoreline, because when that wind starts activating up the water and the bottom, it starts to create that food chain effect where it starts picking up nutrients. The bait fish come in, start feeding on the nutrients, and behind it come the predator fish. A lot of times you'll see the average fisherman out there on the calm side of a point, and they're not catching the fish as you are if you get around on the windy side. So you may have to fight the elements, but your productivity ratio is going to be a lot higher. Depth. To me, that's the key question. When any fisherman comes up and tells me they're having a great day or they caught a lot of fish, the first question I ask is not where, but how deep. If they're telling me they're catching them in 2 to 3 feet of water, I know they're probably on a shoreline. Or if they say it's 5 to 8 feet, they're probably on the outside edge of a weed line. If they're saying deeper, like 10, 20, 30 feet, and I know they're fishing humps or ledges. So it's really important to know what depth the fish are in. To me, that's the most important of all the elements to ask, is what depth they're in, because if you find the depth, then you can usually find the fish pretty easily. The last thing is bottom conditions. I always pay attention to what type bottom I'm fishing. You got rock, sand, pea gravel, muck. There's all sorts of bottoms. Muck, I usually stick to muck only early in the spring, because that's when right after ice out, when the sun starts to warm up the bottom, that black muck will warm up faster. Rock is the second thing in the springtime that warms up fast with the light through radiation. It'll start to warm up and the fish will gravitate to it. But as the spring progresses, you'll find that the largemouth pike and bass will start concentrating more around sand and pea gravel. And then as the summer progresses, it's always rock and weed and rock and a hard bottom. Stay away from muck in the summer, because when you get into muck, the oxygen level has a tendency to deplenish. Let's talk about the first of the key elements, that's structure. Structure to me is very important. In this case, I don't know if you recognize that spot, that's on Lake Champlain. It was taken in November. The water was down. So I got a picture of this. What this was an old pier that came out into the lake, and there was actually a railroad trestle that was out in the middle of Champlain, down at the south end, outside of this point. Over on the sides, a pier that comes off that's squared off with another, looks like an old dock. But when you look back at the history, the railroad tracks came out and they did an actual turnaround out there in the lake and went back in. There's a lot more structure out there, but they dumped a lot of coal ash out there too, so it's a different type of structure on the bottom out there. But a spot like this is very important, because when you have wood, you have shade, you have ambush points, and you have structure. And any bait fish moving along this weed bed hits this wood, they're going to travel along the edge. And it's a great spot for bass or pike or any predator fish to be lurking in the shade as an ambush point for the bait. So my 3 key elements are here: shade, structure, and bait fish. Another structure are your creek channels and drop-offs. In this case here, you got a creek that comes off of the St. Lawrence, and it comes around behind here, and you have an outside bend. And what it is, it's a flowing creek, so you have a nice cut channel that runs through here. And what you want to pay attention to is when you have a channel with a bend, that outside bend is going to be the deepest spot, and it's going to come across. And in this particular case, it's a feeder creek going into the St. Lawrence. And what's nice is that the pike travel up and down here, as well as the bait fish, because you have a flow of water, current. You have a few logs that stick out that have been washed into that creek that hold and break the current and are great ambush points. So what I do is, when I come into a spot like this, I'm casting ahead all the time and trying to get that fish to strike. So pay attention to creek channels, look at the layout, and watch your depth. A lot of times I'll move off to the shallows and fish over across the actual cut in the creek. The next structure, which is kind of neat, are docks and piers. And those are some of the most obvious places to fish. You'll see 99% of the fishermen will fish a shoreline and fish docks. What's nice about docks is they provide, again, avenues where the fish can lurk in the shade and be having some great ambush points. And then what you see, all these openings up here, these cribs here that support the dock have a lot of rocks. You got a change in structure. You got a soft bottom, you got weeds, you got rocks that have tumbled out. And you got just a variety of structure that bait fish, crayfish can survive in, and the fish will sit and lurk, and you don't want to pass up docks. When you're fishing a dock like this, though, you want to kind of work your outside to your inside, or if you're fishing take to the shoreline, then you work your inside to the outside. But try to hit every nook and cranny as you can, because there's that one nook and cranny that you miss is where the big fish is going to be. Another structure, or combination of structure, is when you have weeds and rocks together. To me, that's like the key area. If I have weeds and I have rocks, I have a nice hard bottom, I have structure with rocks, I have weeds and structure, I got shade from the weeds, and I'm going to have bait fish in there, whether it's crawfish or minnows. But that's a key element. This just happens to be right at Larrabee's Point. And on this case, you actually have another structure in there. You have wood that comes across. So you have a variety of different structures where these fish are going to hold. And in this being a launch site, a lot of fish get released. They don't need to go far to hang on to structure, to stay in some shade, and to have bait fish. Another nice thing about this spot is from this point across to Ticonderoga Point used to be a railroad bridge. And the history there is that a couple of the railroad cars had fallen in the water and lost all their debris. And between the 2 points from Ticonderoga Point over to Larrabee's Point, there's a lot of debris out there. And if you go out there with your depth finder, you can find that structure, and that structure will hold fish. Another structure are cribs and wrecks and shoals. This just happens to be going across from Fort Ticonderoga to Independence Point. Back in the Revolutionary times, they had built a bridge during the ice and let these cribs just drop down in when the ice melted, and it formed an avenue they could put their bridge pilings across. And this just happened to be a couple that you can see when the water was low. But if you have electronics on your boat, even a flasher unit, you can go across and find the rest of these that go right across the lake. What's nice about this is you have rocks, you have wood, you have structure, you have something breaking up any current. Again, you're going to have some shade, you're going to have some ambush points, and you're going to have spots where the fish can scoot out and get the bait fish. What you got to pay attention to is what you see on the surface may not be what's under the water. In this case, fortunately it was a clear day. I got down and got my underwater camera. And if you look at that, you got this all undercut. All the rocks that were there had fallen out. There's more in the back. You got the timbers that are providing nice ambush points for bait or for bass or pike to scoot out. And any bait fish that comes by, those fish are going to dart out and grab it. So when you're fishing something like this, if you go back to the surface, you want to work these corners. You want to work the edges. You want to get tight to it because those fish don't want to travel far. They want an easy meal. If you're running a crankbait or spinnerbait way out here, those fish aren't going to chase out that far. But you put it next to them where they can grab an easy bite, where it's tight and fish close to it, your percentage of catching a fish is going to be a lot higher. And I'm not saying there's not fish cruising around the outside, but my high percentage spots are going to be tight to the structure. So what do you look to when you're going to a lake? First thing I do is I grab a contour map. If there's a map of the lake, I want to look at it. Iroquois Lake, which is in Vermont, is a prime example. You pick up this map. If you've never been there, you take a look at it. You got milfoil at this end here. You got a nice extended point which goes out into deeper water, which is a nice avenue for fish that are in the deeper water to work their way into shallows. They're going to follow that highway going in. They're going to follow structure going into the shallows. You got some islands out here in deeper water. They're going to hold fish. Again, an extended point coming out. Any fish going in towards shore for feed are going to follow these routes, like that island and right up to that extended point, and then disperse along the shore. Also, you have some humps out here in this weed bed. Again, you got structure, and depending which way the sun is, in this case, north is at the top, so this is the east. So you're going to have shade, or this is east. You're going to have shade on this side here. So in the morning, you might want to concentrate on the shady sides. So I always grab a contour map. I study it. I look at it. In the springtime, I know this is going to be the shallower area. It's going to warm up faster. And in the north here, I always look at it in the springtime. The northwest corner of any lake is going to be the warmest spot to warm up first. And the reason being is that the way the sun is and the angle of the earth, the rays are coming in. They're hitting the northwest corner of any lake. And that's the first area that's going to warm up on a lake. Other than where you have rocks and darker bottoms that's going to absorb the sun. But the rays are going to be a lot more intense in the northwest corner of any lake. A lot of times you don't have a map, so when you get to a lake, you got to do a visual look. In this case here, when you look, you got a nice shoreline, you got shade, you got rock, you got some deeper water here, you got a shelf where the water color changes. And in this case, it happens to be on Lake Hortonia, and I was crappie fishing. And what's neat about here is where these cliffs are, these rocks are hanging over, it was loaded with crappie. And the crappie were just stacked up in the shade right there. So all I had to do is just cast along these corners here, And when the fly in a bobber, when that little jig just floated down through, those crappie would come out and grabbing it. And there again, it's a visual look. I'm looking for structure, I'm looking for shade, and I got great ambush points for any bait fish. Another visual look when you show up to lake are weed beds, especially the surface weeds. In this case, you got a creek channel coming through a back bay on Lake Champlain. And what you have here is you have a creek channel here, and you got shallow water and you got flats. So you got an avenue where bait fish are going to travel. You got protective weeds where bait fish are going to be cruising back in there where they're protected from the predators, where the predators are going to be anyway because they're going to be feeding on fish. You have the surface being shaded with the floating vegetation and the angle of the sun. And you got great cover and great structure. So my approach here is I'd fish this creek channel first, and then I start to work my way back. And depending on the intensity of the sun, if it's a really sunny day, I'm going to fish the thicker mats where there's more protection from the sun from the weeds on the surface. The thing about weed beds, especially milfoil, is you got to think of it as a tropical rainforest, where all the vegetation is really in the first 8 to 10 inches of the top of the surface. After that, the light penetration is reduced, so the leaf population on the stems is going to be reduced. So your first 8 to 10 inches is going to be a lot of weeds and mat, and below that it's all stems. So you have all open water underneath where the fish are going to travel. They got the canopy of the weeds on top protecting them from the sun, and they can also tuck in, and you got bait fish that are going to be staying underneath there. So it's a great avenue to punch through those weeds and fish that underneath. A lot of times in cold fronts, those fish are normally down cruising all over. When the cold front hits, they stack right up to the top and get underneath those weeds where there's warmth in those weeds. So if you're fishing thick weed beds in a cold front, what I recommend is when you punch through, you use a smaller jig so it has a slower fall. Because a lot of times when you punch through and it drops to the bottom, it'll attract their attention. But in a cold front, they're going to be a little bit slower, so you want a slower dropping bait from that surface to the bottom. Another visual is when you're out there is look for some submerged weed beds and look at the contour of the shoreline. In this case, it happens to be we're on an outside bend, a little back bay right there, and you got an extended point with rocks, and there's actually an island right over here off to the left. And there's a saddle that comes through here, and on that saddle, from the transition from this deeper water to 15 feet to that backwater where it's 6 feet, there's a saddle which comes about 4 or 5 feet that has submerged weeds. So if you work this shoreline, you don't want to just follow the shoreline, you want to follow that extended point and visually look that this point probably extends out into the deeper water, maybe connects with that island, and work it. Don't just get stuck with what you see on the shoreline, but kind of imagine how that structure may extend out into the water. It's a perfect example on islands. Like on this island here, we're looking at the point of the island, and this point extends out toward the reflection of these trees. It comes straight out and it extends underwater. So if you're just fishing the shoreline here, you're going to miss the fish that are out here. Another thing to think about islands, and you see it a lot when you're looking at charts, especially on Champlain, you may see 3 or 4 islands in a row. And look at how they extend out in the water, because a lot of times you may have 3 or 4 islands that show, but there's actually humps that go out. There might be a series of more islands that haven't broke the surface. So I'm always looking at maps, I'm looking at how the terrain is laid off. Is it a point with an island off of it? There might be another point or an extended hump beyond that. Or if I'm looking at a group of islands, like up in outside of Lewis Creek, there's like 4 islands that are laid side by side. And they look like fingers, but if you continue out parallel to that, you'll find that there's 4 or 5 more humps that go out in deeper water that you can't see that hold fish. And the average fisherman is going to, again, go what he sees first and not give the forethought that there's probably extended humps that are going to hold fish. And on those humps are usually weed beds, and it's usually rocks and weeds and bait fish. So you got your structure, you got your light, shade for light intensity and protection, and you got your ambush points, and you also have the fact that bait fish or crawfish are going to be out there. So look at the shoreline visually and kind of envision how that might be extending out beyond under the surface. And of course, you have electronics, they're always a great aid. How to find fish through lure presentation. The first thing I do is I cover the water quickly. If I'm pulling into a bay, I'm looking for activity. I'm looking for the aggressive fish. You come into a large bay and you're like, where do you begin? The first thing I look at is, do I see any bait fish working the surface? Is there any activity? Is any fish chasing fish? And if not, or if there is, I'll start to cover the water quickly. And the 4 lures or type of lures I'll use to cover water quickly are top waters, spinner baits or chatter baits, lipless crankbaits, or softer hard jerk baits. If you'll note that all 4 of those baits are a cast and retrieve. So I'm covering water quickly until I get that aggressive bite. And once I find where I get a fish or two on an aggressive bite, that's what I call, I probably got a pod or a school of fish in that weed bed or in that location. Then I'll slow down my presentation. I'll go to creature baits or worms. It could be a Texas rig weighted worm or a weightless wacky style worm. Something that's going to continue to stay in one area and stay in that water column to find where the fish are located. Or I'll throw jigs. Again, I'll throw jigs that are going to go from the surface, flutter down through the water column to the bottom to get that fish or a drop shot. The whole point is when you find the fish and there's some activity, you want to slow down your approach and start catching the fish that aren't quite as aggressive, but that are hungry. So I start off with those baits there. And once I find what's working, I start catching fish and it starts to slow down. Say I'm throwing a creature bait and I'm catching a few fish and all of a sudden it slacks off. I may switch over to a worm or I may switch over a jig, change up the bait, because they may get tired of seeing the fish and they catch them and release them and they know that that bait stung them for a minute, so switch up to a different bait. So when do you leave? A lot of times in tournaments you may find a pot of fish and fish will school in by size. And if I'm fishing here and I'm catching a bunch of 2.5 pound fish and I can't seem to break that size, that's when I'll leave an area because I'm going to go search for the bigger fish. Other times when the bite just dies down, you leave. Or all of a sudden it just starts, like say they're not biting on that bait, you know they're there, they just shut down. So I leave when I feel like I maxed out my potential in that area. And if I'm just out fun fishing, I'll fish until they just stop biting. So the key is though, before you leave is think about what you did. What was special about the area that you found the fish before you go to another spot? Was it the structure? Was it weeds? Was it rocks? I want to repeat that. Was it the light conditions? Was it the angle of the sun? Was it a morning bite, afternoon bite? Was I fishing the shady side? Was I fishing the sunny side? What bait were they biting on? Were they minnow chasing? Were they bottom bait like crawfish? What type bottom was it? Was it a hard bottom, soft bottom? Which way was the wind blowing? Was the wind blowing in the weeds? Did I have wind? Did I have no wind? I put all that in perspective before I leave. So if I go to the next spot, I want to kind of repeat that same type of pattern. So I go into a bay, I know I want to fish like an open pocket in the middle of the weeds on the shady side where there's a little bit of a breeze. It causes a ripple. It diffracts the light. So I put all that thought in before I go jumping around. The biggest habit we have is we go to the spot that we've caught fish before. We always do that. We have confidence in areas we've caught fish prior, so we'll always do that. But sometimes that doesn't produce a winning weight, because you're not sticking to the pattern. So I always look at where you caught some good fish and stick to that pattern. If that pattern's not working, then you go back to your old habits and try to find what's working and what's not. And a lot of times your old spots will produce. If they don't, there's something different going on. You got to pay close attention to it. Well, that's it. Thank you for attending. I appreciate it.
I got my bait, got my pole, I'm going on down to the fishing hole, all right. All right. Captain Nate gonna lead the way, hop on his boat, go fishing all day, all right. All right.